One thing I've noticed throughout the 2010s, and possibly even earlier than that, is that Sherlock Holmes made a really big comeback in a huge way. Everybody seems to have their own interpretation of the guy, whether it be the movies that came out, like Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, whether it be the TV series featuring Benedict Cumberbatch, I have been assured was good up until a certain point. There was also Elementary, a show which gender-swapped Watson so that now we could justify an awkward romance angle between Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and maybe even throw in Moriarty just so we can add my most hated trope of all, the love triangle. There was a video game that I'd watched somebody stream but never actually played myself. Hell, even Will Ferrell made a Sherlock Holmes movie, and just in case you're wondering, it's one of the single worst Will Ferrell movies I think I've ever seen, if not the worst Sherlock Holmes movie I've ever seen. Bottom line, this past decade, if not even sooner than that, has been really good for people who like Sherlock Holmes. And it looks like the 2020s aren't going to be especially different, because now we are starting to dive into some expanded universe shit here with the latest series known as The Irregulars. I do say that despite having watched all the movies that came out in the recent times, and as well as watching a few episodes of the Benedict Cumberbatch show, and not to mention the one episode of Elementary I watched before I was immediately turned off of the series entirely, I say I watched all this stuff, but if I'm being entirely honest, I don't know much about, like, the proper Sherlock Holmes and the novels that came out long before anything else did. I've never read a single Sherlock Holmes novel. Anything I knew about Sherlock Holmes prior to all this stuff that came out in more recent times was basically cultural osmosis. Like, I knew Sherlock Holmes had Dr. Watson as his faithful assistant. I knew that his catchphrase was, "Elementary, dear Watson." I knew that Moriarty was more often than not the villain of a Sherlock Holmes story. That's basically all I really knew. So I have to admit I'm not especially familiar with the Irregulars and who they are, and assuming they're even canon with the Sherlock Holmes universe, and this isn't just some, like, Netflix original series that just kind of bases it very, very loosely on Sherlock Holmes and just kind of makes up its own story from there. The one thing I will say is I wanted to like this show, but after 3 episodes, I was so done with this show. I'm done. As I said in the Tribes of Europa review, people say, oh, you shouldn't judge a show based on 3 episodes. But then you get a show like The Irregulars, where it's pretty obvious what this show is going to be like the moment you finish episode 1. And I think, yeah, you can. Or at least you can judge this one. The titular Irregulars are basically street urchins. There's like 5 or 6 of them, but the only ones I ever remember off the top of my head are Beatrice and Jesse, who are like the 2 main characters, and I guess Leon is the one who's like the rich kid who wants to be poor. He's like that universe's equivalent of a yuppie or a hipster or a trans trender or something like that, you know? Well, I mean, he's not swapping genders or anything, but the concept, he wants to be something that's edgy because it's cool at the moment is what I mean. There's a lot of supernatural elements in this show. Like, Jesse in particular has the ability to connect with people by grabbing onto their wrist and looking into their mind and seeing what sort of chaos is going on in there. She also has the ability to communicate through her dreams with a slave out in Louisiana. And it's right about there where I started to say, you know what, if you're not going to take this seriously, I'm just going to leave. The overarching idea of The Irregulars is that The Irregulars actually solve most of the mysteries, whereas Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes, maybe more so Dr. Watson, end up taking credit for all the mystery solving, and everybody recognizes them for all the glorious things they do, while the street urchins just get paid like 5 pennies and then told scram. It's kind of an interesting interpretation, you know? I don't think I've seen this one yet. The thing that kind of takes me out of the show entirely is just the presentation overall. Like, I really want to get invested in this, like, old-time Victorian England setting with horse-drawn carriages and street urchins and, you know, just bare-knuckle boxing and several other elements that were commonplace back then. But it's kind of hard to get invested in that when the soundtrack is suddenly cranking up. Turn down for what? Stop singing, I hate that song! The dialogue is also where I take a lot of exception at times, because while I couldn't tell you which ones are legit Englishmen and which ones are faking an English accent, I could definitely tell you for sure that, like, what in the actual fuck is not something you would hear, like, Victorian England people say out loud, you know? It's not era appropriate, and it's kind of the thing that takes me out of the atmosphere, you know, it takes me out of the setting. The more I watch this show, the more I realize this could easily be something that got put on the CW. Like, it's not quite as obnoxious as some of the shows on CW, like Riverdale or any given DC hero, but this definitely looks like something that could have easily been on the CW. And just in case you're new to this channel and not familiar with my sensibilities, let me tell you right now, I fucking hate the CW. Overall, this is one of those times where I regret the fact that I don't have half-hats in my scoring system, because 1 out of 4 seems way too malicious, but 2 out of 4 seems a little too generous. This is one of those times where I had to flip a coin to determine whether or not I was going to introduce half-hats, and the coin landed on tails, so no, we're not doing it. So, very reluctantly, I'm going to give this a very generous 2 hats out of 4. And that's going to do it for this week's review. Be sure to come back next week when I have another review for your viewing pleasure. I promise I won't take the week off rather abruptly for no reason whatsoever. In the meantime, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, like me on Twitter at TommyTealHat, etc., etc., YouTube Shuffle. And I'll see you next time.